In the heart of the Indian countryside, where the air smelled of earth and jasmine, there lay a village so old it seemed to have sprung from the soil itself. The village of Chandipur was surrounded by dense forests and vast fields, and at its center stood a towering banyan tree, its roots tangling with the earth like the fingers of a forgotten god. The villagers called it the Kalpavriksha, the wish-fulfilling tree, but they dared not approach it after sunset. Stories whispered from one generation to the next warned of shadows that moved beneath its branches when the moonlight touched its gnarled trunk. It was on such a moonlit night that Arjun, a young man with restless eyes and an insatiable curiosity, decided to defy the warnings. He was new to Chandipur, having returned from the city to settle his late father's affairs. The city had hardened him, made him dismissive of superstition. What harm can a tree do, he scoffed when the elders warned him about the banyan. A tree is just wood and leaves. The night was quiet when he left his home, the lantern in his hand casting flickering shadows on the narrow dirt path. The village dogs, usually restless at night, whimpered and scurried away as he passed. Above him, the moon hung low, its silver light turning the world into a realm of eerie monochrome. Every step Arjun took seemed to echo louder than the last, and the air grew colder as he neared the banyan tree. The first thing he noticed was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a village night but an oppressive absence of sound, as though the world held its breath. The rustling leaves seemed to whisper secrets he couldn't quite catch, and the shadows beneath the tree swayed even though there was no breeze. A chill ran down his spine, but he shook it off. "Old stories to scare children," he muttered, stepping closer. As he reached the tree, he noticed something carved into the trunk, symbols he couldn't recognize, their jagged lines glowing faintly in the moonlight. His fingers brushed against them, and a sudden, piercing scream erupted from the darkness. Arjun spun around, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. The scream had sounded close, too close, yet the village was far behind him. The air grew thick, almost unbreathable, and the shadows under the tree began to coalesce, forming shapes that shouldn't exist. Arjun's lantern flickered, its light dimming as if something unseen was draining it. He tried to move, but his feet felt rooted to the ground, as if the earth itself had come alive to hold him in place. From the corner of his eye, he saw a figure emerge from the shadows, tall, gaunt, and cloaked in darkness. "Why have you come here?" The figure's voice was a guttural growl, resonating like a distant thunderclap. Arjun couldn't answer, his throat was dry, and his mind screamed for him to run. The figure stepped closer, its face obscured, but its eyes glowing like embers. Around them, the shadows twisted and writhed, as if alive, their movements synchronized with the figure's slow advance. Desperation took over, and Arjun turned to flee, but the path back to the village had vanished, replaced by a labyrinth of roots and vines. The lantern slipped from his grasp, plunging him into darkness. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled blindly, the figure's footsteps echoing behind him. No matter how far he ran, the sound remained the same distance away, a relentless reminder of his pursuer. Then, he heard it, the whispers. They surrounded him, speaking in a language he couldn't understand but instinctively feared. They seemed to come from the very air, each word a clawing presence in his mind. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, and screamed into the void. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his home, the morning sun streaming through the window. The banyan tree was visible in the distance, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. But something had changed. His reflection in the mirror showed hollow eyes and a face pale with terror. On his arm was a mark he didn't recognize, a jagged symbol that glowed faintly, like the ones carved into the tree. The villagers found him sitting on his porch, muttering incoherently. They knew the signs. He wasn't the first to return from the banyan tree broken. Arjun's fate was sealed, and the whispers of the Kalpavriksha would haunt him until the end of his days. Days turned into weeks, and Arjun's condition only worsened. At first, he tried to explain what had happened, but his words were met with skepticism and fear. The villagers avoided him, crossing to the other side of the road when they saw him coming. Even the elders, who usually offered wisdom and comfort, kept their distance. "The tree has marked him," they whispered among themselves. "There's nothing we can do." Arjun's nights were filled with nightmares. He dreamed of the banyan tree, its roots wrapping around him like serpents, pulling him into the earth. The whispers followed him everywhere, growing louder in the darkness. He began to see shadows moving in the corners of his vision, always just out of reach. He stopped sleeping, afraid of what he might see if he closed his eyes. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Arjun decided to leave Chandipur. He packed a small bag and set out before dawn, hoping to escape the curse that had befallen him. But as he reached the edge of the village, he found the path blocked by an impenetrable wall of fog. No matter which way he turned, the fog followed him, forcing him back toward the banyan tree. It was as if the tree itself was keeping him trapped. Desperation gave way to anger, and Arjun decided to confront the source of his torment. He armed himself with an axe and a bottle of kerosene, determined to destroy the banyan tree once and for all. The villagers watched in silence as he marched toward the tree, their faces a mixture of fear and pity. None dared to stop him. As he approached the tree, the air grew colder, and the whispers began again. This time, they were louder, more insistent, as if the tree was trying to warn him. But Arjun ignored them. He poured the kerosene at the base of the tree and struck a match, watching as the flames licked at the roots. For a moment, he felt a surge of triumph. But then, the ground beneath him began to shake. The flames were snuffed out as quickly as they had begun, and the shadows under the tree came alive. They surged toward Arjun, wrapping around him like tendrils. He swung his axe wildly, but it was useless. The shadows pulled him into the tree, and the last thing he heard was the guttural growl of the figure he had seen that night. You cannot destroy what is eternal. When the villagers came to the banyan tree the next morning, there was no sign of Arjun. The tree stood as it always had, its roots tangled with the earth, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. But those who looked closely swore they could see a face among the gnarled bark, its hollow eyes staring out at the village. Years passed, and the story of Arjun became another cautionary tale whispered among the villagers. But the banyan tree remained, its shadow stretching farther with each passing year. And somewhere, deep within its roots, the whispers continued, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to venture into its shadow. But the story didn't end there. One day, a group of researchers arrived in Chandipur, intrigued by the legend surrounding the banyan tree. Dr. Meera Sharma, an anthropologist with a fascination for folklore, led the team. She was determined to document the truth behind the tales, dismissing them as mere superstition. With her were Ravi, a botanist, Anjali, a historian, and Vikram, a skeptic who had little patience for anything he couldn't measure or analyze. The villagers were reluctant to speak to them, their faces shadowed by fear. Only the eldest among them, a frail woman named Kamala, agreed to share the stories. The tree is cursed, she said, her voice trembling. It doesn't just take those who venture too close. It watches, it waits. And when it marks you, there's no escape. Meera dismissed the warning, though a part of her couldn't shake the unease in Kamala's eyes. That evening, the team set up camp near the banyan tree, their equipment ready to capture any unusual phenomena. They laughed and joked to mask their nerves, the oppressive silence of the tree weighing heavily on them. As night fell, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the chirping of crickets. But soon, they grew louder, filling the air with an otherworldly resonance. The team's laughter faded, replaced by uneasy glances and nervous shuffling. Vikram, ever the skeptic, grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the tree. It's just the wind, he said, his voice wavering. Nothing to be afraid of. But as he reached the tree, the flashlight flickered and died. The whispers grew deafening, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift. He turned to run, but the roots of the tree shot out, wrapping around his legs and pulling him toward the trunk. The others watched in horror, frozen in place, as Vikram's screams were swallowed by the shadows. Panic set in, and the remaining team members scrambled to escape. Ravi tripped over a root, his ankle twisting painfully, and the shadows closed in around him. Meera and Anjali managed to reach the edge of the clearing, their breaths ragged, but the fog rose up to meet them, forcing them back. We have to fight it, Meera said, her voice trembling. She grabbed a camera and began taking photos, hoping to capture evidence of the phenomenon. But the camera's flash only seemed to anger the tree. The whispers became a roar, and the shadows surged toward them. Anjali screamed as a shadowy figure emerged from the tree, its ember-like eyes fixed on them. It raised a hand, and the air around them grew impossibly cold. Meera fell to her knees, clutching her chest as an unbearable pressure weighed down on her. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the figure's hollow eyes and the faint glow of the jagged symbols carved into the tree. When morning came, the villagers found the team's campsite abandoned. Their equipment lay scattered, and the banyan tree stood as it always had, its roots tangled with the earth. But those who ventured close swore they could hear faint whispers, as if the tree was recounting the events of the night. Kamala, the old woman, shook her head when she heard the news. "The tree is eternal," she said. "And its hunger never ends." The banyan tree remained, its shadow stretching farther with each passing year. And somewhere, deep within its roots, the whispers continued, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to venture into its shadow.